the recovery has several characteristics that I think are noteworthy, and those characteristics say a lot about the role that Asia is currently playing in the world economy. So let me shift to that and see if I can do the right button this time. What I want you to understand about this recovery is that it is a recovery of variances. Wide variances with regard to the geographies that are recovering, wide variances with regard to the sectors that are recovering, wide variances with regard to the pace at which they're recovering, and the orders of magnitude of the recovery. Let's look at sort of some of this by looking at the left-hand side of this chart. What I want you to see is that, can't walk away from these things, right? What I want you to see is that for the immediate period, the immediate impact of this recession, all economies were affected somewhat comparably. Yes, I won't use the pointer, I'll stick it in my eye as well. China, you may recall, had massive layoffs on the coast that by and large led to a huge movement of the population back to wherever it is they may have come from. India, similarly, everyone suffered in some way. You'll often hear expressed that large swaths of the planet were unaffected by this recession. If that's true, I assure you they were in the middle of Botswana somewhere. Any place that was industrialized, and that is what this left-hand chart looks like. Industrial production, by the way, means manufacturing and mining. That's what the World Bank uses this term. Every country that had any large production operations were affected. What I want you to see, however, is that after that immediate shock to the system where everyone was affected, from that point on there was wide variances in terms of recovery. And you'll see that China and India, again remember this is manufacturing. If I had a services chart, I would show you an even greater recovery in India, an even more rapid and sizable recovery than we see in manufacturing. Recovered very quickly. And we'll come back to why in a moment. And what I want you to also see is that Brazil took a very deep dive. If I had Russia on that chart, you see it would have also taken a very deep dive. But relatively soon thereafter, there too, in Brazil and Russia, across the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, and China, the recovery happened much more rapidly than, on the other extreme, the advanced industrial economies. But even here we have wide variance. The one economy that has suffered the most from this recession, the one economy that continues to suffer the most from this recession, is not the economy that sort of began the problem, that is the mortgage crisis in the United States, it is Japan. And it stands out in a very noteworthy way because Japan had always been sort of different, unique among advanced industrial economies, at least with regard to this sector, industrial production. Generally speaking, among the several definitions or certain indicators you would look for an advanced industrial economy is a manufacturing sector where its contribution to GDP is usually in the high teens, low 20s, but generally not much above 21, 22%. In Japan, that manufacturing sector, until this recession, was in the mid to upper 20s. Very different even than Germany, say, the European Union or the United States. That will not be the result after this recession. In fact, if you look at manufacturing's contribution to GDP in Japan, this year, our preliminary numbers showed Japan to be the lowest among industrialized countries. Before this recession, it had the largest manufacturing sector measured as a percentage of GDP among advanced industrial economies. It had, in other words, the greatest adjustment to make, and that dip in the chart is what that adjustment looks like in Japan. And so should it come as any surprise to those economies that are highly dependent on either Japan as a market, or Japan as a source of supply, or Japan as a source of investment capital in your industrial base, your level of dependence on Japan, to the extent that you are highly dependent on Japan, the reverberation effect of this recession on you will be great. The same can be said, of course, with regard to the United States, with regard to the European Union. But not nearly to the same degree as we're seeing going on in Japan. From a historical perspective, Japan is going through that same structural adjustment process that we had seen at an earlier time in the U.S. and in the European Union. It's just happening in a much more collapsed time frame as a result of a direct shock, and that being this recession of 2000. On the right-hand side, what I want you to see is, as a result of this slowdown in advanced industrial economies, as a result of the wide variance in the recovery rate of China and India versus, say, a European Union or Japan, Asia's relative position in the world economy has changed. Now, that relative position I'll define in a very narrow and simple way to begin with, and that is to just say, what is Asia's share of global GDP? So of all the wealth created on the planet, what is Asia's share? Now, the answer to that question varies depending upon a variety of factors, not the least of which is the exchange rate we choose to use. This chart has two exchange rates that are commonly used. One, purchasing power parity. I'll come back to what that means in a moment. But if you use that very artificial exchange rate, you would see that Asia's relative position, which has already been growing over the last several decades, continued its climb, and we're probably now to the point where Asia's total contribution to global wealth may be approaching something around, certainly over a third, say 35 or so percent. A word on what purchasing power parity means. It's an artificial exchange rate. You can't go to a bank and say, give me the PPP rate. They will show you where the restroom is if you ask that kind of question. They will misunderstand the question entirely. But to put the PPP rate in context, think about it as a way of assessing the value of the dollar in your economy. One of my favorite examples for this happens to come from India, because India is a country where I've spent a good portion of my adult life. And it is in India that this PPP differential has had a huge impact on its growth. Think for a moment that you are General Electric and you're looking at setting up research centers around the world, as GE has done. And you have research centers in the United States, and let's say you're paying your engineers on average, I'll just make up the number to keep the math simple, $100,000 a year. And this person that you've hired at that particular rate happens to be an Indian. Maybe went to the Indian Institute of Technology in Kanpur, but has, for whatever personal or other reason, decided to come and work in the United States and is now in this R&D center. That was the condition GE found itself in when Jack Welch took over General Electric in the early 1980s, and their research center in upstate New York in Niskayuna, he discovered sometime around the late 1980s, about a quarter of its scientists and engineers were largely of Indian origin, and they had often come from a variety of schools, not the least of which was IIT Kanpur. For those of you who don't know IIT Kanpur, generally, if you can't get into IIT Kanpur, you go to MIT. It's sort of the rank ordering in terms of the value school. MIT is the institution down the river from where I work. Locally, MIT, you may know it as the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. We generally call it MIT Made in Taiwan. Has a lot to do with the student body population, the folks that go there, etc., not to mention the fact that we are rivals in just about it. Imagine that same engineer Jack Welch will see with the same, or at least the same resume, maybe not the same individual, also went to IIT Kanpur, but for whatever personal reasons, that person wanted to stay in India. But I could buy that resume for that person and set up an R&D lab, as Jack Welch would do, in Bangalore. Well, you can imagine he's going to pay something, obviously, for that person, and at that particular time, you would have found that GE was paying roughly $30,000 US equivalent for the same resume of what he was paying in the United States, $100,000. That differential, that 30 versus 100, that differential gets you to your PPP rate. What that tells you is that the Indian rupee is seriously undervalued relative to its purchasing power. That individual making $30,000 in India actually might have a higher standard of living than that individual making $100,000. because he might have his dobi, his amma, his any number of household servants, which in upstate New York, if you have them on a part-time basis, and usually only on weekends. So the point here is that it's meant to try to capture a value, not seeing that you and I can't capture in a market, but nonetheless can be captured in this particular example by the value of a resume and the value of the skills that someone's bringing and what I have to pay in relative terms for that. But again, remember, it's an exchange rate that neither you nor I can ever get. But if you believe the world is flat, which I don't, but if you believe the world is flat, all of the exchange rates you're going to use are going to be the PPP ones. Because it's going to show wide distribution, geographic distribution of value-added activities. And you can see by that little blue chart that Asia's relative ranking in the global economy has increased, and it continues to increase post-recession, or during the recession and subsequently in the late 2008, 2009. Now let's look at the other exchange rate. What I want you to see here, it's a market exchange rate. It's as equally confusing, that phrase, market exchange rate, as is the PPP one. The market that determines that exchange rate has absolutely nothing to do with the market forces that you might think of determining the price of oil or the price of wheat, etc. The market here is the market that you and I encounter when we convert whatever currencies we're holding at the bank or at the hotel, the market we encounter to exchange those. In other words, it is not an exchange rate that's necessarily determined by a market. It's an exchange rate that we simply find a market to make our exchange. After all, the Chinese renminbi, the Indian rupee, several currencies around the world are not not determined through any kind of market that would look like a competitive marketplace. But nonetheless, that market exchange rate, when I use that, that's again, remember, that's the exchange rate that all of us would be able to use to buy assets in another country. That's the same exchange rate we would be able to use to buy the services of that engineer I was talking about in Bangalore. In fact, use that market rate to convert various economies into U.S., the value of various economies into U.S. dollar. You're going to get a very different story as to what has transpired during and after the recession of 2008. What I want you to see is what's generally happened in Asia is Asia has finally recovered, or is close to recovering, the value, the huge value that had been lost by the late 1990s at the time of the financial crisis that gripped not only Malaysia, but Thailand, the Philippines, Indonesia, Korea, and a variety of other economies across this region. In other words, Asia's contribution to global GDP is not, by this measure, the 35% you see looking at a purchasing power parity distribution, but is something closer to 27, 28%, which is just under the peak of Asia's contribution to the global economy, which is occurring in the late 1990s. Asia has emerged as a very important engine of growth, unambiguously, as have other regions. And especially Asian industry, by which I mean Asian manufacturing and mining, has emerged as a major engine of growth in the global economy at a time when, at least among advanced industrial economies, and to an extreme, Japan, are having a serious restructuring crisis that they are having to work their way through. Now, what I want to do is to take those two different exchange rates and apply them to the top 10 economies around the world. Because I want us to look at the relative contribution of these top 10 economies to global GDP. And in the process, we'll learn something about what's going on in Asia, but we'll also, I hope, learn about the dynamics that are at work that are changing the relative role that all emerging markets are playing in the global economy.